Well, it is my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Anoop Nannra. Anoop is the director of Cisco's corporate strategy and strategic innovation group. His focus is on identifying disruptive technologies, accelerating their adoption through business incubation, co-development, co-innovation, partnerships, investment, and acquisitions. In addition, Anoop is also the co-founder and chairman of the Trusted IoT Alliance, an open source industry initiative focused on the intersection of blockchain and the Internet of Things. Anoop has a proven track record of delivering world first class innovative disciplines, including security, optics, service provider, video, switching, Internet of Things, and he currently leads Cisco's blockchain team and initiative. So without further ado, help me welcome Anoop Nannra.
All right. Wow, there's still a crowd here. That's fantastic. So before I get started, I wanted to just quickly, thank Perry Ann and the Chamber for having us here. I think bringing this collective together, the brain trust that's in this room, is fantastic. It's, you're probably not going to find this quality of brain trust anywhere else on the planet. And so, super, super excited to be part of this. So just to just highlight the talk here, I'm going to talk a little about, building the machine-to-machine economy and what's required. What are the ecosystems? What are the use cases? What are the frameworks that are going to be required when we start having machines communicating and doing business with one another, right? And it extends beyond machines, right? And I'll get a little bit into that a little later. So, in around the time when we went to Dubai for the trade mission, my 9-year-old asked me, what is this blockchain that you so often like to speak about? And I started getting into like Satoshi and, mining and proof of stake and this and that. And, I don't believe Satoshi's a man. I think it's a woman. I think it's actually Perry Ann. And he says, Dad, I'm 9. I don't have all day. And then he says in a British accent, when one is to profess expertise, one must express them in simple terms. This is from a 9-year-old, right? I'm looking at my wife, and I just got schooled by a 9-year-old, right? And I thought about this, and recognized that he likes watching baking shows. So I said, blockchain is like eggs. Eggs is a binding agent. It provides structure. It provides integrity in baking. And he's like, I get it. Now we can move on with our day. So, we started talking about this, and I started, well, what is this? Like, this egg thing that I just came up with. What does this mean? And, we look at the use cases over the last couple of years, and we see that there's been an evolution. And there's been an evolution in financial services, right? We're seeing, and we've heard a lot of speakers in the last couple of days talk about net new markets, net new industries that are being created as a result of blockchain technology. And we're seeing increasingly, recently, I would say in the last 18 months, blockchain actually connecting and integrating with the real world. So you take a look at the blockchain and the real world, and what does that mean? A couple of years ago, and in a quick show of hands, who remembers the Internet of Everything marketing that was going around, right? And I profess, Cisco was, we were right in there in that theme as well. You take a look at people, you take a look at process, you take a look at data, you look at things. The Internet of Everything never really took off, right? And I'm convinced it never really took off because there wasn't really a solid structure or solid organization that could be put in place to tie all these things together. And so I think I think blockchain will be the underpinning for the Internet of Everything. So what does that mean? It means we have ecosystems, we have partners, we have suppliers, we have vendors, we have business orchestration, we have governance and compliance that we just heard about being executed in smart contracts, ensuring that people within an ecosystem are actually working towards the ecosystem's benefit. We have assets, physical assets, digital assets, online, offline, right? And we have the Internet of Things. We do have assets that will be generating data, that will be out in the field, that will be put in place and put in production for sometimes years at a time. And so what we need to provide, and what I think blockchain can provide us with, is the tools necessary to provide integrity and structure around the Internet of Everything. So let's talk about going to the next step. What do we actually need for the Internet of Everything? And we've heard a couple of times in the last couple of days, identity. Of course we need identity. We need strong identity. We need to be able to uniquely identify devices. We have KYC requirements in the financial services space. Why don't we have KYD requirements? We could take it a step further and talk about software. Now we have KYA requirements, know your agent. Because in a future world, we may be having software agents that move and act on our behalf. Obviously, we have things, right? And so devices. We heard from Stephen from Rivets yesterday, new models around providing identity and locking down, digital fingerprints of physical assets and physical devices. We have space, not just location, not just GPS, but relative space, right? Longitude, latitude, and altitude, right? And I'll get into a little bit of a use case that talks about where space is a requirement. And of course, time, right? Time-stamped, time-synchronized, transactions, events, what have you. These 4 pillars will form the underpinning of what is going to be required to put structure in place for the Internet of Everything as we look at driving the next new industries. And of course, we need common primitives, right? We have all of these facets of Internet of Everything and IoT. We need the ability to address and interact with these assets, interact with blockchain networks in a common way. You look at all of the IoT blockchain companies that are out there today. For the longest time, they were all kind of trying to figure out, their own unique value around how do you register an asset? How do you verify an asset? How do you get an update from an asset? How do you transfer an asset? And at some point, and we're starting to see more and more, digital wallets that live in assets. But these are the kinds of the use cases and the applications that you would use these 5 basic primitives for. Now, obviously, there's a load of use cases out there. And obviously, financial services has been extremely hot in the last couple of years, will continue to be hot. But even in the banking sector, we're starting to see know your device and know your agent requirements starting to emerge, right? So we're starting to see IoT being taken seriously in financial services, in the insurance space. There's a lot of opportunity here where if we can start bringing together the integrity around the business process, the workflows, the IDs, the devices, the people, we can actually create a whole lot of value. And of course, electric cars, right? There's a great set of use cases around electric cars and autonomous vehicles. And if you have the identity of an electric vehicle and you have an anchor of trust that you've created and you have a digital wallet on that electric vehicle, that electric vehicle can pay for its electricity. When it's an autonomous vehicle, it could get paid for services, right? And this is a use case that we see time and time again. Take it a step further, and you could have two-way charging. You could have an electric vehicle get paid for charging another electric vehicle in time of emergency, right? It's a technical limitation today, but there are some solutions that are starting to emerge in that space. Industry colleagues at Chronicled have shown a really interesting use case around the delivery of drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, prescription medication from a pharmacist to a home. But let's unpack this use case for a second, right? This use case requires a fairly sophisticated and complex ecosystem of folks that you may not think will be participating in this ecosystem, right? So, if we have our Internet of Everything ecosystem that is all tied down and locked into, blockchain, we have a patient, we have a doctor, we have a pharmacist that is triggering a workflow around the refill of a prescription medication. That is an event that goes to a pharmacist. The pharmacist says, yes, this is a valid refill order. I'm going to execute it. Registers a drone, assigns a drone to the task. The drone has to have an identity on this in these environments. The drone has to be proven to have not been compromised, right? So now you've got a drone manufacturing ecosystem that needs to be onboarded into a blockchain environment. That drone manufacturing ecosystem may have its own supply chain. It will most definitely have its own supply chain and its own potentially blockchain network that it operates into. As the drone starts taking off and flies from the pharmacist to the patient's home, it needs to respect no-fly zones, right? The FAA and NASA have been working closely on trying to figure out how do they create safe zones for autonomous UAV vehicles that are flying through the air. How does a drone prove that it's not been flying through a zone that it's not authorized to fly through, right? So now you've got a government agency that has to be involved in understanding when a flight's registered and what actually happened in that flight. And of course, there's time and location, and then there's the space, right? What is the flight path? How do we verify it? How do we attest to it? How does infrastructure, as we heard earlier this morning, how does infrastructure participate in that role? And of course, when the drone lands or arrives at the patient's home, do we expect window manufacturers to start connecting and instrumenting windows? Do we expect home automation solutions to start connecting into blockchain networks, right? There are companies that specialize in these things, but I bet many of them don't know what blockchain is, right? So there's more education that needs to be done to facilitate this use case. Take a look at Foam, another interesting company that is actually geospatially indexing blockchain transactions. They're actually creating a framework to incentivize the implementation and instantiation of infrastructure, beacon-based infrastructure, LoRaWAN-based infrastructure, so that when things like drones are now being tasked to deliver drugs, there is an infrastructure play in place, right? There is infrastructure that the drone will need to connect to and interface to. And this is where some of what the protocols that they're working on around proof of location. We can now do proof of proximity as a result. And this is another interesting use case. We're seeing this use case come up time and time again in the connected car space. Vehicle-to-vehicle communication has been around for a while. Vehicle-to-vehicle to infrastructure is a use case that is now starting to emerge. So I presented this, obviously in Germany, because these are all German cars. I should have at least a Tesla and a Ford on here. But think about this. You've got vehicles that have an anchor of trust. In this case, BMW, Mercedes, and Porsche have a supply chain that is anchored in blockchain, and they can prove the entire, the build, the execution, and the delivery of the creation of that physical car and the software that goes in that car. It's an anchor of trust that they've created built into the car itself. But when we talk about platooning as a use case, where now car-to-car communication is important, if you have a platoon of 35 vehicles that have decided to organize themselves to improve fuel efficiency, to reduce drag across the cluster, if you have a new vehicle that is asking permission to join that platoon, who decides if that vehicle can join? How does that new vehicle prove that it's a trustworthy vehicle? Right? It's an interesting problem. And so this will require new technology, new solutions, and I believe blockchain technology to actually make this happen. You take a look at traffic management along stretches of highways. There's a race on right now in many jurisdictions around the world where countries, municipalities are competing to be the world's first autonomous vehicle-ready infrastructure. All right? We have autonomous vehicles. They're coming. They're already here, but the infrastructure is not ready for it. Right? If you take a look at traffic management and quote unquote real-time recommendation systems today, when you get in your car and you're driving on the road and you ask for a recommendation on a route for a destination and you get traffic alerts, updates, that data is typically on average between 10 and 30 minutes old, right? The way that it's orchestrated and managed and delivered today. If you have infrastructure, roadside infrastructure, that allows you the ability to make real-time local decisions and recommendations on traffic, on routes, you've now got the ability to make more efficient someone's commute. But if it's an autonomous vehicle and there isn't really a human that's actually involved, if the infrastructure is compromised, now you've got the ability to send someone off course. But if you've got an anchor of trust extending into the supply chain locked down by blockchain in this roadside infrastructure, now you've got the ability to drive kind of end-to-end integrity for this kind of use case. And so at the Trusted IoT Alliance, one of the things that we're looking at doing is pulling together the framework for how do we actually orchestrate all of these things. What are the asset life cycles, right, that are in the field, whether it's a car or a drone or a smart sticker. What are the integration patterns? How do you integrate blockchain and IoT into existing systems, existing networks? What are the protocol preferences? Blockchain is just one tool of several tools that could be leveraged, right? And so there is technology that exists. We're not proposing that blockchain replaces these. Blockchain could augment these. And of course, we're trying to pull together a reference architecture that the industry can adopt. So, in terms of reference architecture, what we've kind of defined is what are the roles that different participants within the ecosystem play, right? Not everyone is a blockchain protocol developer. Not everyone is a sensor manufacturer, right? So everyone has their role that they decided to play in. We have protocol references, right? So TR69 is an example. MQTT is an example. These are existing tools and technologies that exist that we can actually leverage and integrate potentially into blockchain technology as well. And of course, we have integration patterns. There's going to be a wide variety of infrastructure design patterns that we can leverage, that will be leveraged, that will be created, that will allow us to take data from the field and integrate it into blockchain solutions. And of course, there's the asset lifecycle itself, provisioning events, tracing, asset track and trace, decommissioning, from, in supply chain terms, from sunrise to sunset, there's a certificate of destruction that should be issued, right? How do we track all of that? And of course, when we start introducing smart contracts to drive automation and process efficiencies in all these environments, at the edge, we create really, really interesting solutions. So I'm actually running out of time. But one of the things that we're looking at doing is creating Planetscale Trust. I mean, I think that's what everyone in this room is trying to figure out. Right? How do we create Planetscale Trust? I don't believe that there will be one blockchain network or one blockchain protocol, one blockchain solution. There will be dozens, hundreds, maybe even thousands. But what we need to figure out as a collective is how do we drive interoperability? How do we drive open standards? How do we drive common implementations, reference implementations of smart contracts that can be certified, potentially even legally defensible, right? Because now when we start connecting blockchain into the real world, we have the ability to impact people's lives. And I think that is one of the challenges that's ahead of us. So if you look at the kind of the use cases, you have the ability to connect different industries together as a result. So once you create interoperability, you have the ability to create entirely new segments, new markets, new industries. And with that, that's a wrap. Thank you.